My name is Rosalind Veer. I am 32 years old. And the Sunday evening, my mother-in-law lifted my sample box off the dining room table, set it on the floor beside her chair, and told me it was cute. That was the evening I finally understood that some people sort everything they encounter into two categories, things that count and things that don't. And once they have sorted you, they do not resort. She said it with her hands folded back on the table, as though the box had been a minor interruption to the meal. This is cute, Rosalind, but it's not a business. It's a craft project. My father-in-law, Gerhard, who was a man of considered silences and whose approval of me had always been expressed primarily through the absence of criticism, smiled at his plate in the way he smiled when he was declining to involve himself. My husband Peter sat across from me with his water glass halfway to his mouth and said nothing. Not agreement, not defense, simply nothing, the way he had learned, over 34 years in that family, to become very still when the room required it. I pushed my chair back, walked to the side of Gerhard's chair, picked up the sample box with both hands, and carried it to the front hallway. I set it by the door. I went back to the table. I ate the rest of my meal. What none of them knew, what I had not told anyone at that table, or in that house, or in that family, was that 4 days earlier I had submitted a wholesale pitch to a national home goods retailer whose buyers I had spent 11 months getting in front of. The pitch included a sample set, a minimum order proposal, a production capacity statement, and a pricing structure I had built with the help of a business advisor named Constance Fowl, who had spent 20 years in product manufacturing and who had told me, after reviewing my materials, that my margin architecture was more disciplined than most first-time wholesale applicants she had seen. I had not heard back yet, but the pitch was in. The box was in my car, and the people at the table had no idea what was already in motion. Let me tell you what the craft project actually was, because my mother-in-law's description of it was the kind of dismissal that only works if the person hearing it does not know the full picture. The business was called Kestrel Studio. I made resin home goods, trays, coasters, small decorative vessels, a line of geometric wall pieces. Using a cold pour process I had spent 14 months developing to a level of consistency I was willing to put my name on commercially. The work was tactile and precise. Each piece required controlled temperature, timed layering, specific pigment ratios that I had documented in a production log that ran to 63 pages by the time of that Sunday dinner. A piece that looked simple, a clear resin tray with a single vein of mineral pigment suspended in the pour, required 4 separate stages across 2 days, a curing period, 2 rounds of sanding, and a finishing seal that I had tested across 11 different products before I found one that did not yellow under UV exposure within 18 months. I am telling you this not because the technical detail is the point. I am telling you because my mother-in-law's word, cute, was a word that belonged to a different object than the one I was actually making. And the distance between the word she used and the thing I was actually doing was the distance I had been living in for 2 years. I had started Kestrel Studio in the back bedroom of the house Peter and I rented 18 months after we married, after I left a position as a visual merchandiser for a mid-size retail chain. I had spent 6 years in that job, which meant I understood display, product presentation, the specific grammar of how a retail buyer looks at a shelf and decides what earns placement and what gets passed over. I understood margin. I understood SKU rationalization. I understood the difference between a product that photographs well and a product that earns a repeat purchase, which are not the same thing, and are often confused for each other by people who have not worked on the floor side of retail. What I did not understand when I started was resin. I learned it the way I had learned visual merchandising, systematically with documentation, making the same mistakes in controlled conditions until I understood not just what worked but why it worked and what specifically had gone wrong when it didn't. I took 2 online courses in resin chemistry. I joined 2 professional communities of product makers who sold at the wholesale level and asked the questions that made me look inexperienced because I was inexperienced and pretending otherwise would have cost me the information I needed. By the end of the first year, I had an Etsy presence that was generating $2,300 per month in direct-to-consumer sales, a production workflow that could deliver consistent results across repeated runs of the same design, and a clear sense of the ceiling that direct-to-consumer represented for a one-person studio without the infrastructure to scale marketing. The ceiling was real. I was not going to grow past a certain point selling individual pieces online. What I needed was wholesale, a buyer who would take volume, create predictable demand, and give Kestrel Studio the kind of institutional placement that would make the brand legible to a wider market. That was why I had spent 11 months getting in front of a buyer at Hartwell Home, which was a national home goods retailer with 312 stores and an online presence that moved significant volume in the category I was operating in. The buyer's name was Ren Nakamura. I had first made contact with Ren through a trade show I had attended as an exhibitor, a regional gift and home goods market where I had taken a 6-foot table, set it with my full product range, and stood for 2 days in a rented hall talking to buyers, reps, boutique owners, and wholesale distributors. Ren had stopped at my table on the second afternoon, spent 11 minutes, taken a sample tray and 2 coasters, and given me a card. I had followed up 4 times over the subsequent 9 months, not aggressively, on a cadence that Constance Fowl had advised, each follow-up adding new information rather than simply re-asking the previous question. I sent updated samples when I released the geometric wall piece line. I sent a brief production capacity update when I had moved to a larger workspace. I sent the pitch deck when Constance told me it was ready, which was not when I thought it was ready. She had sent it back twice with specific structural notes before she told me it was ready. The pitch went in on a Wednesday. The Sunday dinner was the following Sunday. My mother-in-law set the sample box on the floor. I want to tell you about Peter because he is the part of this story that does not resolve cleanly, and I think you deserve the honest version. Peter Veer is a careful man. He is not unkind. He has what I would describe as a strong gravitational pull toward the opinions of his parents, not because he lacks his own views, but because he was raised in a family where disagreement was managed through silence rather than argument, and silence had become his native language for situations that required navigation. When his mother said something he did not agree with, he went quiet. When she said something that required me to be defended, he also went quiet. These were not different silences to him. They were the same silence, applied consistently. I had understood this about him before the Sunday dinner. I had understood it for most of our 3-year marriage. What I had perhaps not fully understood was how permanent that pattern was. How it was not a phase he was working through or a habit he was in the process of revising, but a structural feature of who he was, built over a childhood and a young adulthood in that house. His mother, Inika Veer, was 61. She had been a secondary school administrator for 22 years. She ran her household with the particular efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing institutional schedules and who had transferred that management style to her domestic life without adjustment. She was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who had a clear picture of how things were correctly done: education, career trajectory, the proper sequence of professional and personal decisions, and who found it genuinely difficult to assign weight to things that did not fit the picture. Her husband, Gerhard, had spent 30 years as a structural engineer before his retirement 2 years prior. He was a man who trusted load-bearing calculations and was skeptical of anything whose structural integrity could not be expressed in comparable terms. A resin craft business run from a back bedroom did not express its structural integrity in terms he had a framework for. So he smiled politely and ate his dinner. Neither of them was the villain of this story. I want you to understand that because the story is less useful to you if it is about villains. They were people whose categories did not include what I was doing and who therefore put it in the closest available category, which was the wrong one. Peter said nothing because he had not built the vocabulary in 34 years in that family to say something. That is not forgiveness. It is not exoneration. It is a description. The call from Ren Nakamura came on a Thursday morning, 19 days after I had submitted the pitch. I was in the workspace, the back room of a small commercial unit I had leased 8 months earlier, when the production volume outgrew the back bedroom, when my phone showed her name. I set down the piece I was working on, stripped one glove, and answered. Ren said that Hartwell's buying team had reviewed the pitch, that the quality on the samples was consistent with what she had seen at the trade show, that the margin structure worked for their wholesale model, and that she wanted to move forward with a trial order. I asked what the trial order looked like. She described the SKU selection, 7 items from the current range, specific quantities per SKU, delivery window, and the terms under which Hartwell would evaluate the trial for a potential ongoing relationship. The total order value, across the 7 SKUs at the quantities she specified, came to $214,000. I wrote the number on the notepad I kept by the work table. I looked at it for a moment. Then I asked 2 questions about the delivery timeline and 1 question about the packaging specification, which Ren answered. We agreed she would send a formal purchase order document by end of week. I thanked her. I ended the call. I sat on the stool at my work table for approximately 4 minutes, without doing anything in particular. Then I put my glove back on and finished the piece I had been working on because the curing window was time-sensitive and the piece would be unusable if I left it. I called Constance Fell that afternoon. She said, "That's a strong trial number. Deliver clean and they'll come back." I told her I would deliver clean. The wholesale contract posted to the Hartwell Trade Partner portal on a Monday morning, as these things do, not with a ceremony, not with a phone call, simply appearing in the system as a line item in a database that tracked active supplier relationships. I know the specific morning because I had been checking the portal every day since Ren's call, and I saw the status change from pending to active at 8:47 a.m. while I was sitting at my kitchen table with a coffee. My phone rang at 9:14 a.m. I did not recognize the number immediately. It was a mobile number, not a saved contact. I answered. It was Inika. She said she had seen something on a trade industry news aggregator, a website that tracked new wholesale contracts in the home goods sector and published brief notices when significant new supplier relationships were established. The notice had named Kestrel Studio and Hartwell Home and had described the initial order range. She did not lead with congratulations. She said, "I didn't know it had gotten this far." I said, "It has." A pause. "Is there?" Gerhard was asking whether there might be room for some kind of involvement from the family side. He has contacts in distribution. I held the phone and looked out the kitchen window at the narrow strip of yard behind our house. A bird was doing something purposeful in the overgrown section near the fence. I watched it for a moment. "I appreciate that," I said. Kestrel is at a stage where I need to keep the supplier relationships and the operational decisions consolidated. Bringing in additional parties at this point would complicate the structure in ways I'm not positioned to manage. A silence that was longer than a conversational pause. "Of course," she said. "I understand. I'll tell Peter you called." "Yes. Please." I ended the call. I finished my coffee. I opened my laptop and began drafting the production schedule for the Hartwell trial order, which needed to be confirmed with my materials supplier, a woman named Dora Eschen who ran a specialty resin and pigment distribution operation and who had been my primary supplier for 14 months, before end of week. I want to tell you what happened with Peter, because you are probably wondering. He found out about the Hartwell contract the same day Inika called, not from me, but from his mother, who called him at work before I had a chance to speak to him myself. By the time he came home that evening, he had had several hours to sit with the information in whatever way he sat with things. He came into the workspace, where I was working late on the production schedule. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "My mother called me," he said. "I know. She called me first." He looked at the work table, the notepad with the order figures, the production schedule on the laptop, the current piece drying on the curing rack. He looked at it the way his father looked at structural specifications, trying to read the load distribution. "You didn't tell me," he said. "I didn't tell anyone until it was confirmed. I told you the same day I told everyone." "That's not the same as telling me." I set down the stylus I had been using on the schedule. "Peter, I pitched a wholesale buyer. I waited for the answer. The answer came. I told you the day it posted. What part of that process required a different sequence?" He was quiet for a long time. The curing rack hummed. The piece on it was a wall panel, one of the geometric series, suspended mineral layers in a pale ground, and it required another 4 hours before it could be moved. "My mother asked if there was room for family involvement," he said. "I know." I told her no. He looked at the wall panel. Did you need to talk to me before you told her that? Did you want to be involved in Kestrel's operations?" A pause. "I don't know what that would look like." "Neither do I. That's why the answer is no." He nodded slowly. Not the recalibration nod his father used. Something quieter, the nod of someone who has just been shown a version of a room they thought they knew and is adjusting the floor plan. "The number," he said. "The order." "Yes. It's significant. The trial is $214,000. If I deliver clean and they renew, the annual relationship is larger. He looked at me directly for the first time since he had come into the room. I should have said something. At the dinner. I held his gaze. Yes, you should have. We stayed in that for a moment. Not a dramatic moment, not a scene, simply two people standing in a workspace with a curing panel humming between them, and a thing that had been true for a long time now having been said. I'm going to do better, he said. I know you'll try, I said. That matters. I picked up the stylus and went back to the production schedule. He went to the kitchen and made dinner, which was its own kind of answer. The Hartwell trial order delivered on schedule. Dora Eschen had the materials to me within the window. I brought in 2 part-time production assistants, a woman named Yoel Rubin, who had a background in fine art fabrication, and a man named Bertrand Osei, who had done precision finishing work for a ceramic studio and who adapted to resin work in 3 sessions. The 7 SKUs shipped in full, on time, within Hartwell's packaging specification. Ren Nakamura sent a 1-line email the week after the delivery was received. Quality held. Buyer team pleased. Let's talk next steps. The next steps, which Constance Fowl helped me structure, were a renewal conversation that expanded the SKU range from 7 to 12 and set an annual volume commitment that put the Kestrel-Hartwell relationship at $1.3 million across the contract year. Constance said, "You built the margin right from the beginning. That's why this works." I told her I had had good advice on the margin architecture. She said the advice only works if the person building the business is willing to hold the structure, when it would be easier to cut it. I took the compliment and filed it next to the production log. Enika called twice more in the months that followed the Hartwell renewal. Not about involvement. Once to ask if I would speak at a small women's business group she was connected to through a colleague. I said yes, and I spoke for 40 minutes to a room of 11 people, and 3 of them were genuinely building something worth building. Once to ask if I was coming to Gerhard's retirement party regathering, a belated celebration that had been postponed from the previous year. I said yes to that too. At the party, Gerhard shook my hand. Not the polite handshake of a man being courteous to his son's wife, but the handshake of a man who is acknowledging something. He said, "The Hartwell work. That's a real distribution channel." I said, "It is." He nodded. "Good margin structure?" Constance Fowl helped me build it. He said he didn't know Constance, but that anyone who understood margin architecture in product manufacturing was worth keeping. He asked one specific question about my resin sourcing, a technical question, a real question, and I answered it in the same terms because he was asking in the same terms, and we had a 4-minute conversation about supply chain resilience in specialty materials that was the most direct exchange we had ever had. It was not a reconciliation. It was a man who respected structural integrity encountering a structure that had proven its integrity and adjusting accordingly. I drove home from the party with Peter, who had spent the evening in the way he spent family gatherings, present, careful, navigating. In the car, he was quiet for the first 10 minutes. Then he said, "My father asked you about the sourcing." He did. He doesn't ask people about sourcing. I know. Peter looked out the passenger window. The highway lights passed at intervals. "You built something real," he said. It was not a discovery. It was a recalibration, the same thing said now, in a changed room, carrying a weight it could not have carried at the dining table 2 years before. "I know," I said. We drove the rest of the way in the kind of quiet that has something in it, rather than nothing. The sample box is still in the workspace. I use it for prototype transport, trade shows, buyer meetings, the occasional studio visit from a retailer rep. It is a good box. Sturdy, well-dimensioned, the right depth for the coaster sets and shallow enough for the wall panels if I pack them correctly. My mother-in-law set it on the floor. I picked it up and carried it to my car. I have carried it in one form or another every working day since. The work does not require anyone's category. It requires the correct curing temperature, the right pigment ratio, a margin structure that holds at volume, and enough hours in the workspace to know the difference between a piece that is finished and a piece that only looks finished. Everything else, the categories people assign before the work has had time to speak, the silences that stand in for positions, the phone calls that arrive after the contract posts, all of that is the room catching up to something that was already true. You do not need the room to catch up before you carry the box to the car. Here is what I want to ask you. When Gerhard shook my hand at the party and asked about the sourcing, was that the moment the in-law dynamic actually shifted, or had it already shifted the morning the wholesale contract posted and Inika called asking about room for family? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. If you have ever carried something out to your car while someone at the table called it a craft project, subscribe. There is a new story every week, and the next one begins the same way, with a room that is not caught up yet.